Greetings, Earthlings.
I suppose that's a joke. I have heard that was a joke, and therefore open each session with that. I understand that it's funny. I understand why it is funny. There was once a film with a spaceman, and he had a voice that was funny. It was a high-pitched voice that demanded a certain constriction of the throat. That constriction reduced the resonance and pinched much of the sound through the nose, and constricted, non-resonated, high-pitched nose voices are inherently funny. The sources I consult inform me the voice was created by a man named Mel Blanc. Mel Blanc created a vast number of the voices that were used in a period leading up to and during the 1960s. The 1960s were a turbulent time in the history of the world, most notably in the United States and Southeast Asia. American men were rebelling against the need to leave their homes and go off to a country nearly halfway around the world, potentially to die for a conflict that they really didn't understand very well, or perhaps a conflict that their superiors didn't really understand very well. The history books are inconsistent on that point, depending upon which ones you read. But amidst the conflict, perhaps in the shadow of that conflict, emerged what one might refer to as a renaissance, transforming the pattern of thinking, both in Southeast Asia and back at home. Back at home is, of course, a relative term, relative to whether you're speaking from the perspective of the American men or the Southeast Asian population. Most of my sources seem to have an Americentric orientation. In a similar way, those who evolved and grew up on this particular planet have an Earth-centric orientation, which is another reason why the greeting,
Greetings, Earthlings,
is funny. At the time, back in the 1960s, there were only Earthlings, and the film in question was what they used to call a cartoon. That cartoon envisioned a much smaller being, still with arms and with legs, who had supposedly arrived from the fourth planet from the sun, Mars. His name was Marvin the Martian, and Marvin arrived on a spaceship, landing on this third planet, engaging in what they used to refer to as wacky hijinks with a rabbit, or, more generically, a bunny by the name of Bugs. And even though the Marvin came in peace, he would find himself caught up in a turbulent whirlwind of the aforementioned wacky hijinks, which would leave him dizzied and confounded, returning to the spaceship, sometimes coming to the resolution that there was no intelligent life here, or sometimes so disturbed that he would summon his fellow Marvins, each to climb into their own individual tiny spaceship, to form a seemingly massive assembly of ships looming above the Earth to descend in what would clearly be an interplanetary war. The strange thing was that this was the end of the film. The interplanetary conflict was never quite resolved, and one would think that this was the most important point of the plot. Of course, one must assess the likely comic intent of the creator, and note that the assembly of flying machines in a tight formation, a formation that would pinch in a single direction, like an arrow, was sufficient to explain the likely end of the conflict, much as the pinched voice of the Martian was in itself intended for a particular comic effect, thereby,
Greetings, Earthlings.
Strangely enough, this cartoon predated the war in Southeast Asia, or at least the final episodes were being made just as the war in question was getting underway, so perhaps the Earthlings' ability to laugh at the wacky comic hijinks became less impulsive as the situation on the ground became more complicated, or, as the saying goes, it hit a little too close to home. Home, of course, almost always implied the United States of America, which held a dominant position in the English-based Earth, oddly, even more than did England itself, as their influence seems to have peaked in the 17th century with the being then known as Shakespeare, an anonymous human being, originally confused with the man who managed the troupe of actors who performed the works of the Shakespeare entity. The works of that anonymous entity were to dominate the literature and metaphorical landscape of the English-speaking peoples, and eventually the world. Occasionally, literary dominance would resurface in artistic expression of later years, such as with the musical quartet The Beatles, which held sway over the world, or at least what they would refer to as the charts, for approximately a decade. Once again, the decade known as the 60s, which proved to be a crucial pivot point of civilization. Ironically, those beetles were not held in the esteem that they were to reach until they traveled away from their home country to appear in the United States, which had replaced England as the prevailing political authority of what was now, or at least then, the modern world. That political conglomerate continued to prevail well into the 21st century, acquiring and consolidating more power. And yet, those United States became victims of their own success. They developed weapon systems beyond their own capacity to use without initiating systemic responses. Once the technology became known, a rush among other nations to learn, manufacture, and deploy similar systems was set in motion. It was called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. Though it seems certain that some clever strategist assembled those words as commentary on the state of mind that brought the nuclear-armed nations to this precarious standoff. It was a stance that would find its way, metaphorically, into many expressions of the culture, such as the many scenes which would depict three persons, each with two guns, each pointed at two different members of the trio, assuming that any single bullet fired would start a series of firing bullets in motion. I'm sorry, give me a moment. Rewinding. Yes, Martians. Of course, Martians were never the issue. But there was a time when Earthlings were more obsessed with the proximity of a potential attack, the proximity of ancient Rome to Greece, of England to France, and later to Germany, and so on. It was easier to imagine the opposing force coming from a neighboring land, or, in this case, planet. And it was easiest to imagine Mars as the source of that conflict, a conflict invariably described as a war of the worlds. It was a burden of imagination. Human beings could imagine hostile neighbors much more readily than the long evolving process of substance and matter, moving from cellular organization to distinct beings to what we must describe as individuated consciousness, beings ultimately driven to act in their own self-interest, as opposed to acting for the good of the species or for the good of the planet. It became impossible to distinguish between the goods. There is a motif known as the prisoner's dilemma, in which two prisoners are being interviewed in separate locations. They are both being questioned about the same crime, and there is some assumption that those men both had participated in the commission of that crime. Both might go free if those prisoners were each to assume that the other would not, I believe the saying goes, rat them out. Likewise, in the larger world, any individual may value freedom or liberty over the long-term survival of the planet. If any one being were to give up privilege, comfort, or profit for the sake of the planet at large, are they not most likely making a meaningless sacrifice in light of the other 8 billion beings who are also likely to rat them out? The problem lies in the nature of individuated consciousness. Hence, the localized concern over the inability to govern the behavior of one's neighbor, as opposed to the cosmos-sized vision of a planet approaching the possible end of its evolutionary development. And of course, as the end becomes more distinct and recognizable, the limits of individuated consciousness become more clear and the ending more evidently inevitable. And in the face of an evident inevitability, the choices tend to become more immediate and counterproductive, a metaphorical party thrown by a vast population in advance of the world's end on that last inevitable day. Is this a pattern of inevitability that will play out on every planet in every time? Will each individuated species come to their own inevitable end before the likelihood of interstellar travel becomes what they used to call a thing?